I just couldn't figure it out. I knew I was tired. I knew I was exhausted, but it really had just kind of become my new normal. It's just sort of how I felt every day. And I was acknowledging that every time I'd walk into my store, my first thing I would say to one of my employees was, oh, I'm just tired. And this is not how I had always been, but it was just kind of slowly starting to be this way. I noticed that when I was waking up in the mornings, I was really having trouble getting motivated to do what I had always done, whether that was go for a run, go for a workout. I wasn't having that same motivation to do it. But I did what I had always done because it's all I knew to do, which is to push through it, right? Grind it out. Don't be lazy. Wake up. So I was still doing all of the things, but I wasn't feeling how I had always felt doing this stuff. And what really ended up happening, because I kept writing it all off, maybe it's my age and, I'm running a couple of businesses, so naturally I am tired. But I started to notice my running pace. This is really what tipped me off that something is going on. And this is kind of embarrassing, but I had actually thought that my Garmin watch was broken. And I went and bought a new one because surely my pace, it wasn't getting my pace right, because I know my pace. I've run many half marathons. I know exactly what my pace should be. Even if I'm not running regularly all the time, I know where I should be. And turns out my previous watch was fine. So now I have two Garmin watches, both telling me that I'm running slowly. And my exercise performance it was just going down. I wasn't feeling the same. And so finally I decided I've got to figure something out. And so I she's a medical doctor who has transitioned into practicing functional medicine. She does acupuncture. She's amazing. And I just said, I've got to figure out what is going on with me. And so I gave her all of my symptoms, and I recall telling her exactly how I felt. But one of the main things that I felt was that I was lazy. I felt that I was being lazy. I mean, I have a history of waking up at 3:30 in the morning, every morning, to get my workouts in, which, if you know anything about a sleep cycle, you pretty much should be REM sleeping at that time. But I did it, I pushed through, and I did that for years. And so I knew how to do those things. We ran a series of tests, and she sat me down at the end to give me my results. And she said, "Dear, I never want to hear you call yourself lazy again, because that you are not, but your body is trying to give you some signals here, and you need to start paying attention because you are in full-blown adrenal exhaustion. Your cortisol levels aren't even registering within any type of range. They have just completely bottomed out. And I don't know how you're getting through your days." And so that really, it kind of just gave me this permission to say, okay, maybe I don't always have to grind it out, push it out. If my alarm clock goes off and I'm just feeling so tired, maybe it's okay if I do sleep in a little bit longer. Maybe my body really is trying to tell me something. So that's a little bit what I want to talk to you guys about today, because a lot of times we can get started on this journey and we change how we're eating and we're feeling so much better. And then it could be years down the road where we go, I haven't changed anything about my nutrition, but something has changed with my performance, with how I'm feeling. And so sometimes we need to involve some lab testing. So based off of this diagnosis from her, there was a lot that I had to do to get myself out of that hole. I had to, there were some lifestyle interventions, which really was the biggest thing for myself. Taking that time for that self-care, for some meditation, for some grounding, for some just simple downtime, setting my alarm clock a little bit later. And while I wasn't able to just not work out anymore, because it's just has always been a part of my life, I really had to scale back on what it was that I was doing in order to heal. So, and then of course there were some, supplement protocols as well that I had to follow. But I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about that today, because there can be a lot more to this than just what we're eating. And so we'll talk about optimizing our performance with our nutrition, but also with lab testing when necessary. So now that you know a little bit about me, I'll introduce myself to you. My name is Tanya Pennington Miller, and I'm a functional nutritional therapy practitioner as well as a certified diabetes specialist. So I specialize in fat loss, in digestive healing, and optimizing performance. So in optimizing performance really covers a lot of things. This is not necessarily just for your athletic performance, although it covers that as well. This is also going to be optimizing your performance in life. Maybe it's with your job, maybe it's as a parent, maybe it's as a spouse or a partner with somebody, but just feeling so much better in your days. My husband and I own a brick and mortar supplement and nutrition store. So I've had that store for over 7 years now. We have this store in Central California. This is also where I run my practice out of, my functional nutritional therapy practice. So I see clients locally in my office there, and then I also see clients remotely. So I do a lot of Zoom calls for people who don't live local to me. So a little bit about my athletic background. So figure competitions were a huge part of my start into my workout experience. So this show, I believe, was 2004, but my very first show I competed in was in 2001, and I did this for quite a few years. I was not a ketogenic athlete at this point. I was a hungry athlete at this point. There were actually times where I was eating 9 times a day, and I'm not exaggerating, because what my coach told me was that my metabolism was just on fire and I was burning and churning. And so that's a great thing that I'm hungry so often. So I was eating every 2 hours. Fast forward to now, I know that really my blood sugars were just dropping between each meal. So my body from a physiological level was making me hungry. Did I get lean? Yes, absolutely. I did very well in these competitions. This particular competition here, I took first place and overall. I loved it. I absolutely thrived while doing it. This is definitely a eating for aesthetics sport and not eating for your performance type sport. And so eventually around 2012, I actually hung up my figure suit and my heels, and I switched over to competing in CrossFit competitions. I now was learning to eat for my performance, and the aesthetics just sort of came with it because you're working your tail off. But it was a whole new eating regimen for me. And so I still hadn't switched over to being a ketogenic athlete at this point, but I had switched over to being more of kind of like that paleo/zone. So I had really driven my fats up quite a bit, brought my carbohydrates down, and did very well at that. I thoroughly enjoyed competing in CrossFit competitions, traveled across the states to do it, qualified for competitions in Minnesota, in Florida. I definitely have a history of putting everything into anything that I do, hence probably the adrenal exhaustion. And so I did this for quite a few years as well. And competing in CrossFit competitions did overlap a little bit with my start in running half marathons. And it turned out that I ended up being a pretty good runner. I never had realized it. I had always enjoyed short distances, but I was really never interested in the long distances because I didn't think I was really good at them. And then it turned out that I ended up being pretty good at half marathons. I generally was taking podium, and I started out with these half marathons, following the zone approach, the paleo approach, and then shifted over into being a ketogenic athlete, which is where I really saw a lot of the benefits of being a fat-fueled athlete. And so I think my fastest race that I've done was a 6:59 pace per mile, which I think put me at about an hour and a half finish. And so I really do enjoy, for some reason, doing half marathons. Now, what I will say is I always said, I will never run a marathon. And I would like to encourage you to never say never unless you for sure want to do what you say you're never going to do. So what I did is I was already running some Spartan races, but I was running the shorter distance Spartan races, the 3-milers, the 8-milers, and then the 13-milers, which are their beasts. And one day, I don't know what the heck, but I got a wild hair and was reading up on their ultra distances, which are 30 miles. And if you know anything about marathons, marathons are 26.2 miles. This ultra is 30 miles more than a marathon. And I brought the idea up to my husband about, hey, what do you think about me doing this? Wasn't sure if he was going to turn down the idea, but he supported my crazy idea. And I started training for an ultra. And so it turned out that actually running a marathon, the 26.2 miles, really just ended up being a warm up for my full distance of 30 miles. I think I ran 26.2 miles maybe 3 weeks before my actual race. So never say never unless you for sure want to do it. But throughout this Spartan race, I have been 100% a fat fueled athlete. And so through this 30 miles, fat fueled. And the nice thing about that is you don't have to do too much intra-race fuel. Yes, I had some with me, but nothing like that of somebody who is relying on carbohydrates. We'll get into that a little bit too. So for this race in particular, I ended up with a 2nd place finish, and certainly could not have been more happy about that. Now, also, like I mentioned, I run short distance Spartan races. And the reason that I'm bringing up both of these is because you'll hear a lot of times people talk about how, you know, eating a ketogenic protocol maybe is great for long distance athletes, for endurance, but it's not so great for glycolytic athletes or the shorter distance athletes. But this particular race right here was a 3-miler, which is as short as they get with Spartan, and also a 2nd place finish here. So for myself, it really has worked fantastically, both in my short game and my long game. Okay, so today we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about the benefits of being fat fueled on your performance, the benefits of being insulin sensitive on your performance, and really the importance of being insulin sensitive. And then some lab testing that may benefit your overall performance depending on, you know, what your symptoms are and what it is that you're feeling. So the benefits of ketones on performance. We're going to talk about metabolic adaptations. We'll talk about faster and enhanced recovery, which is one of my favorite, as well as favorable body composition changes. And I think this is probably really the number one reason that a majority of people sort of embark on their ketogenic lifestyle is they've heard the stories of maybe a friend who, you know, lost 50 pounds on keto. So I understand that motivation as well. So our metabolic adaptations that happen, our rate of fat oxidation increases twofold. So this makes you an incredibly efficient fat burner. And that's our goal here, is to efficiently be able to access our fat stores. So this is really important to endurance athletes because we have so many calories of fat available to us on our bodies. I mean, we're just carrying this energy around with us. So we can store anywhere from 20,000 to upwards of 100,000 calories of fat on our bodies. And we're better able to access it when we're fat adapted. And we'll talk about that too, because you're not always able to just access those calories. So, and like I mentioned earlier, this reduces the need for intra-race fuel. So I don't have to carry around a bunch of race fuel with me, even though that race took me just under 9 hours to finish because it had, I believe, 69 obstacles throughout the 30 miles. But I didn't have to take too much. I think every hour or two I might have taken something in. And I'll talk about one of those supplements that works really well for me personally in these athletic endeavors. So we also experience faster and more enhanced recovery. And I think that this should be a huge one. So ketones have a very anti-inflammatory effect. And so it is thought that this may be one of the reasons why we're able to recover faster after workouts. And I will tell you that it's really been interesting since becoming a ketogenic athlete, how I am able to go run an event, and couple days later, I actually feel pretty good, comparative to before being a ketogenic athlete, where I'd have, a down couple of days or even a down week, depending on the distance and how many hills were involved. We experience less oxidative stress, and this is major. So we have less free radicals floating around our bodies. And this adaptation to our training allows us to put more into our training. So it's kind of like tenfold here. So we're able to train, we recover faster, so we can train again sooner and be more, have more intensity in our workouts because of our rate of recovery. And then our favorable body composition changes. So this is, again, probably the #1 reason that a majority of people are interested in a ketogenic approach, and including the clients that I work with. So what we see on a ketogenic approach, we see this reduction in weight from fat loss. And this one's major. So I make sure that all of my clients get on, I have an InBody 570 scale at my store and that I utilize with my practice so that we can really see what's going on inside. I don't care so much that your, the gravity, the way that gravity is pulling you down onto a scale. I really don't care so much what that scale says. I want to see what's going on with your body composition. And what we see time and time again with following a ketogenic approach is that the weight that we lose is generally fat. And so in the past, before working with a ketogenic approach, we would find that when somebody is losing scale weight, we usually will see that 1/4 of that weight generally tends to be a loss in lean body mass. And that's just kind of an accepted number. But with a ketogenic approach, because ketones are so muscle sparing, we find that this doesn't happen quite as often. So, which leads me to my next point, that muscle mass is more easily maintained. So a majority of athletes do take a supplement called branched chain amino acids, or BCAAs, and you can still take these as a ketogenic athlete. However, your need for them goes down pretty drastically because these ketones are really working for you in your favor. And then there's a huge benefit in sports where power to weight ratio matter. And this is going to be in most sports. This allows us to become more efficient at our respective sport. So I know for myself, being a Spartan athlete, I want to be strong because I want to be able to get through all of the obstacles I need to get through, but I also want to be as light as I can be because I'm hanging from things, right? I'm hanging from monkey bars and swinging on ropes and things like that. So it's really important to have that low body fat percentage, but also maintain that lean muscle mass. So why the high carbohydrate recommendation for performance all of these years? Because we hear it time and time again, and I get this from clients regularly. And this will be clients who, they know what I do, they know about my practice, they know how I work with clients and athletes. And I'll still have athletes come to me and say, okay, I need your help. I'm wanting to get faster, or I'm wanting to get stronger, or I'm wanting to get, fill in the blank with my sport. And I know that you like the ketogenic, the keto diet, but I don't know that that will work for me because I need the carbohydrates for energy. So, and I don't blame them for having this thought process. We have to realize that the main funders of exercise research have primarily been people who make carbohydrate products. So it's always really important to see, who's funding this research, who's funding this study. So it's something like somewhere around 99% of the researchers are dependent on funding of these companies. And this is really an important thing to look at with any studies that we are looking into. So, for example, a bit off topic, but the cholesterol studies that are out there. why do we think that when these studies are put out there for, you know, what level our cholesterol levels should be at, every time we go through a study, that number decreases? It used to be okay that our total cholesterol was at 300. But then the pharmaceutical companies come out and they say, hey, well, you know, we're curious. We'll fund this study for you. No problem. We'll take on the bill. But let's see, you know, where do people, at what level should somebody really start taking statins? And so then they do the study and then we come out and it's, oh, okay, well, 250, we can't be above 250 or you need to be on statins. Okay, so we have this whole group of people now who are being put on statins. And then we do the study again, and they're more than happy to fund it. You know, no problem, we'll take on the bill. And after the next study, now we can't be over 200, right, in total cholesterol. So we really have to take a look at who is funding these studies. And so I digress, but this is what happens here with these carbohydrate recommendations. We really have to take a look at who has vested interest in these studies. So carbohydrate dependence. High carbohydrate diets force us to be reliant on carbohydrates. So we are needing this constant refueling during our races. We're unable to access any other fuel source for energy. We're relying solely on our glycogen stores and our blood glucose. And it doesn't take very long to burn through 2,000 calories. Do you know about how long it takes to burn through 2,000 calories? It takes about 22 to 23 miles of a marathon. Anybody ever know somebody who bonked maybe somewhere around 22, 23 miles? Or maybe some of you have experience with bonking yourself in marathons and you just can't come back when that happens. Well, generally speaking, this is what has happened. You've burned through all of the calories that you could possibly store on your body in the form of glycogen. So what happens when you burn through these 2,000 calories of stored glucose or glycogen on your body? Well, what happens is you enter ketosis. So, and then you'd say, well, if you say there's all these great benefits of being in ketosis, then why wouldn't that be a good thing? The problem is you're not keto adapted. So maybe some of you have been through that initial phase of what's called, quote unquote, the keto flu, right? So a majority of people go through that when starting a ketogenic protocol. Who wants to go through that at mile 22 of a marathon? Nobody, right? But that's what ends up happening to these athletes when they burn through all of those calories. And now the only thing they have on their bodies left to burn is the fat, but they don't have the access to it. They're not efficient at burning that fat for energy. So their body starts to produce ketones, but their body's like, what the heck do I do with these? And so what happens is they bonk. I mean, you'll literally see people like crawling across the finish line, right? Because there just is no coming back from it when you get to that point. So metabolic flexibility is one of the most fantastic things about being fat adapted. So being fat adapted allows us to utilize glucose when it's present and then revert right back to using fats for energy when we've burned through it. So it's kind of ends up being like a rocket fuel for us when we utilize carbohydrates during our races, our competitions, and our training. We've turned blood sugar and glycogen into secondary fuels, allowing us to train harder, perform longer, and recover faster. But sugar burners do not have this same flexibility. So they are not able to burn through all of their sugars and go back to using fat for energy. So this metabolic flexibility is one of the greatest benefits of being fat fueled, is now we have more to utilize. So our fat reserves, I talked earlier about, we can store anywhere from 20,000 to upwards of 100,000 calories of fat on our body. Even the leanest fat adapted athlete will store 20 times the amount of energy as fat than the maximum level that a sugar burner can store of carbohydrates. The leanest athlete. So while it only takes a few hours to deplete glycogen stores with vigorous exercise, so again, maybe about 22 miles of a marathon, Fat adapted athletes will have enough reserves to exercise for several days. I don't know that you want to do that, but you would have the ability to do that by accessing your fat stores. I always think of that on that show. If any of you watch Naked and Afraid, I always think, gosh, too bad they're not fat adapted. They'd probably, do a little bit better out there. So let's get into the next section, talking about insulin sensitivity versus insulin resistance. And I think we hear a lot about insulin resistance these days, but maybe we don't necessarily hear too much about insulin sensitivity. It's certainly not something that our conventional medicine system talks about. So insulin sensitivity refers to how sensitive the body's cells are in response to insulin. So if you have high insulin sensitivity, this allows the cells of the body to use blood glucose more effectively, reducing your blood sugars. So this is somebody who can have, let's say, a piece of chocolate cake or something that contains sugar. Their body's going to recover from that sugar very quickly because they're very insulin sensitive. Their body is very responsive to that insulin, allowing it to bring the blood sugar levels down in the proper amount of time. Now, insulin resistance occurs when the cells in your body stop responding to insulin, or they're starting to stop responding to insulin. The result of insulin resistance is high blood sugars as well as high circulating insulin in the bloodstream. Because what happens is when our blood sugar levels remain high, our pancreas gets confused, for lack of a better way to put it. And it keeps shooting out more and more insulin because it's thinking, oh, well, maybe I haven't sent out enough insulin because my person's blood sugar levels are still too high. So we send out more and more insulin. And then now we're ending up with a bloodstream full of a bunch of sugar and full of a bunch of insulin. So, and really here's the problem with this, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but what happens when we have so much insulin in our bloodstream all of the time, we no longer can access our fat stores for energy. We actually lose the ability to release stored body fat into our bloodstream to burn it off. So I'll get into detail about that here in a minute. So insulin sensitive athletes may benefit from incorporating carbohydrates before, during, and or after exercise. It's not something that you have to do, but it can benefit some athletes. So these athletes will be able to utilize the glucose when it's present and then efficiently switch right back to burning fat for energy. And so there's a lot of fat-fueled athletes who like to do this because, again, it just sort of acts as like a rocket fuel in your body. You burn right through it, you feel good from it, you go right back into using your fat for energy. Now, insulin-resistant athletes would have to be very careful. So any of my one-on-one clients that I work with where we are dealing with insulin resistance, and we know this from our lab tests, we will not incorporate any type of carbohydrates until we have achieved insulin sensitivity. So carbohydrates around workouts would not be recommended for anybody dealing with insulin resistance or who has full-blown type 2 diabetes. Insulin-resistant athletes are going to convert excess carbohydrates into triglycerides in the liver and adipose tissue, producing an unfavorable metabolic state. So we have to be really, really careful with that and making sure that you are insulin sensitive before we can incorporate any kind of carbohydrates. Because we have to think of insulin as kind of like this gatekeeper that either allows you or doesn't allow you to use your fat for energy. So insulin gets to decide whether our body fat can be released or not. So when insulin levels are consistently high, our ability to use fat for energy is essentially blocked. And here's what happens. So we have this insulin hormone. There's another hormone called glucagon, which we really don't hear about too often either. Insulin and glucagon have this, they actually have a great relationship and they work very well together. But insulin and glucagon, they like to play on the same playground. And in this case, the playground is our bloodstream. They like to play on the same playground, but the problem is they can't play on it at the same time. So the point of insulin is to lower our blood sugar levels. And the point of glucagon is to increase our blood sugar levels when necessary, which allows us to release stored body fat into our bloodstream to burn it off. But what happens here is when insulin stays on the playground too long, and this is what happens when we become insulin resistant, insulin is staying on this playground for too long, it trumps glucagon. Glucagon cannot come out to play because glucagon looks out the window and says, oh, insulin's still out there. I guess I can't go out there yet. And so we literally lose the ability to use our stored body fat for energy. So it's very important that we work on becoming more insulin sensitive. So how do I know? Am I insulin sensitive or am I insulin resistant? This is really something that conventional medicine should test for. It should be a part of a regular physical when they're running your cholesterol numbers because they love to run those. So we'll talk about this. We'll talk about some lab testing options and which one would include a serum test for insulin as well. But I highly recommend if you haven't had your insulin levels tested, that you do that. And the problem with our conventional medicine system is that they like to run labs where if something comes back out of range or if something comes back showing you have disease, then they can give you a pill for it. And this is why they run cholesterol so often, because there's definitely a pill they like to give for it. But unfortunately, if your insulin levels are high, they don't have a pill to give you to bring your insulin levels down. And so they just assume not run it because medical doctors are trained to identify disease and then prescribe a drug for that disease. So I'm going to talk to you for a minute about my personal preferred training carbohydrate choice, because I get asked this question a lot of times. And I've searched high and low for my perfect training and competition cocktail. I've tried many things. I have found many things that do not work for me. I personally do not benefit from simple sugars or even from honey before or during my training events. And now this is not to say that this is the case across the board. I'm talking personal experience here because I know there are a lot of fat-fueled athletes who they say they benefit from those simple sugars. For myself personally, it just absolutely does not work. I actually will feel like if I take in a goo or some kind of gel that has simple sugars, I will end up feeling like I have tree trunks for legs. It just feels like it stops me in my tracks. So I have found something, and I have zero affiliation to this company. This is just something that works for myself. So the company is called UCAN, and they have a super starch. So this super starch is derived from waxy maize and is processed using a proprietary heat moisture method. What's unique about this is the molecular weight of this super starch. So it's somewhere between 500,000 and 700,000 grams per mole. And the significance of that is when you compare it to the molecular weight of glucose, which is much lower at 180 grams per mole. Okay, so this goes to show that that glucose really is going to be taken up a lot quicker. So what we're going to have from this super starch is enhanced fat oxidation. So this heavier molecular weight leads to slow absorption that significantly blunts spikes in blood sugar and insulin. So we're not getting this crazy spike coming up of those blood sugar levels where insulin's having to come out and take care of all of those sugars. So this enhances the breakdown and oxidation of fat during exercise. And what's really interesting about this is that ketosis is maintained. And I've tested this theory. So it's interesting because depending on which super starch you use, I think they've got some where there's 22 grams of carbohydrates in a scoop, and then I think it goes up to maybe 28 grams of carbohydrates in a scoop, but zero sugar. It's a resistant starch, so there are zero sugars. And so by utilizing this, and I generally will utilize it either before a run, and then I'll even take some in if I'm going to be running for more than, say, 90 minutes or a couple of hours, then I can take in a little bit more of this to keep me going. And so, but after my workouts, I'm still in ketosis. So that works really well for me. The simple sugars just don't, but it's something that you can try for yourself to see what works best for you. So we're going to finish this up with talking about some lab testing. Now, this is the part where, you've been following a ketogenic approach. Again, maybe initially you were really feeling all of the benefits from it. And you just started to feel like something wasn't working anymore, but you hadn't changed anything with your ketogenic approach. So I'm going to talk to you about 4 lab tests that I run fairly often with clients, and have certainly run them on myself multiple times as we go through and try to heal. So the first one is the GI map stool test. This is a gastrointestinal microbial assay plus. We will also, and that one's interesting. You do have to catch your own stool. You kind of catch it in this little Frito boat tray thing, and you ship it off. We also test the MRT 170 food sensitivity test. So this is a mediator release test. This is actually testing for any inflammation caused by specific foods in your body. There's also a comprehensive blood panel that we'll go over, as well as the DiagnosTechs adrenal stress panel, which really has become such an important one. So starting off, the GI map gastrointestinal microbial assay plus stool test. This is really the foundation of all of the tests. So what I find a lot of times, it can really be kind of like sexy to do a food sensitivity test, because sometimes we can find those out there like on Instagram or something, right? Like find what your food sensitivities are. But if we don't take care of what's going on in our guts first, it is really in vain that we are removing foods that we're sensitive to. So we really have to start, this is the foundation. Our food sensitivities are caused by whatever disruption we have going on in our guts. Okay, so the GI map test, this is one of the most sought after medical tests today to examine your microbiome through DNA analysis. And that's what's important about this. We're not just like taking a smear of your stool and putting it under a microscope and hoping that we can find whatever in that small smear. They're actually looking for DNA of anything living in your gut. This is going to provide information about any bacteria, parasites, yeast, or viruses living in your gut. We get answers about dysbiosis, inflammation, liver detoxification, the possibility of IBS or IBD. And then we also get to learn how well you are or aren't digesting and absorbing your proteins and your fats. We get a lot of information from this test. So this is going to help us to identify the source of disruption, allowing us to create a healing protocol to heal from the inside. Because see, if all we do is say we test our adrenals, because that's kind of sexy too, because a lot of people want to know like, oh, what's going on with my cortisol levels? Well, we can put together the best supplement protocol for you, the best lifestyle interventions for you to follow. But if you don't get your gut right, whatever is going on in your gut is perceived as a stressor to your body, therefore stresses your adrenals. And so it's just kind of like picking out the curtains for your new house without, having the foundation set yet. It's like, we've got to get the foundation set before we go and pick out all the bells and whistles. And so a lot of times we don't even order an adrenal test until we've gone through an entire healing protocol from the results of this GI map test. Then we can address adrenals. So another test that goes hand in hand with this GI map test is the MRT 170 food sensitivity test. So this is the most complete blood test for food sensitivities. And again, this is testing for foods that are inflammation causing in your body. So this is very different than, a food allergy, okay? Knowing the foods that we're sensitive to is one of the first steps in being able to heal our gut to rid of the symptoms that we're experiencing. This could be bloating, gas, acid reflux, constipation, loose stool, going to the bathroom after every meal, any of those things. Removing the food stressors allows us to address inflammation, intestinal permeability, and removes the blocking factors to total health. This is what we have to realize. Food sensitivities are caused by disruption in the gut, and we will continue to be sensitive to foods until the gut is healed. So here's the thing. Here's why we can't just order a food sensitivity test and remove all the foods that we're sensitive to. If that is all we do, we still have the disruption going on in our gut. We still have going on whatever caused all of those food sensitivities. And so what happens is we remove those foods we're sensitive to, we are just going to create new food sensitivities. So now you had your test that shows avocado is fine, but months on out, you've been eating a ton of avocado, right? Because your test said that it was fine for you, but now you've built up a sensitivity to avocado as well because you've removed all the foods that you were previously sensitive to. So we have to go in there and do the healing work in your gut while removing the food sensitivities, because the foods that we're sensitive to are also stressors. So these food sensitivities are stressors to our bodies, and they stop us from healing as well. So you have this combination of both. Let's see what's going on in your gut. Let's see what we're dealing with in here. We find sometimes people have H. pylori. There's several things that can be going on, candida. And we find this a lot too when somebody does switch to a ketogenic protocol and you pull those carbohydrates. Well, those carbohydrates potentially could have been feeding candida for many, many years. And so then when you pull those carbohydrates out, you stop feeding that candida, they get really mad. As a matter of fact, they get pissed. And so you start having these die-off reactions and you feel horrible. And so then people will say, well, keto just wasn't for me because I felt terrible on it. And so I really encourage people to do some further investigating if that is something that's happening to you. We can usually get things figured out with a GI map test. Next, I love to run the comprehensive blood panel because these are just a series of labs that you just can't get your conventional medicine doctor to run. I won't say never. Of all of the clients that I have worked with, I have probably had 5 who have a really good relationship with their doctors, and the doctor actually was willing to order these labs. What happens a lot of times is if doctors aren't familiar with running some of these, they don't necessarily know the codes to get this covered by your insurance. And so that's why they have trouble even doing this or identifying, why would I want to run your homocysteine? It's just not something that they run, nor do they know why. And so some doctors are fantastic. A few of those I've actually been able to get on the phone with to explain why we want those run for the work that we're doing together. And then they're able to find a code. So a lot of it depends on, your relationship with your doctor. So this comprehensive blood panel is a blood serum panel consisting of 21 markers that's going to reveal invaluable information about your health. So we get to know about any nutrient deficiencies you might have. We get to know about your thyroid health. And I'm talking a full thyroid panel, not just simply your TSH that your doctor likes to run or your TSH and your total T4. We run a full thyroid panel as well as an antibody panel to see if we have any type of autoimmune component happening. We learn about your cardiovascular health, your liver, gallbladder health, kidney health, insulin markers, inflammation markers. We get to know about hydration. I totally told on myself by doing this lab because I was like dehydrated all over the place. How embarrassing, right? Practice what you preach. And so I had to start drinking my water. And methylation, we need to know about methylation activity. This gives us a lot of information about your liver health and how well you are, actually able to use and absorb the B vitamins that you are taking. So conventional medicine runs labs to identify disease, whereas a functional practitioner runs labs to optimize your health. And so I even encourage you that if you've had some labs run to, find somebody, a functional practitioner who can help you look over those labs, because what happens a lot of time is people will get lab results from their doctor and the doctor says, everything looks great. And the reason the doctor is saying everything looks great is it's not because they've scoured every single result, but they're just looking for whatever is out of range, right? So, but here's what we need to know. there is a range. So from here to here, as long as your results come in somewhere in between, from a conventional standard, yes, that's the case. But now, if I jump over one spot and now I'm on the other side, now I have disease. Well, wouldn't you have liked a warning? So what we do when we look at these with a functional perspective, we look at the full range, but we come here in the middle and we say, here's the optimal range. And we're going to warn you when you're still okay, but now you're coming out of the optimal range and you're headed toward disease. So let's do something about that. That way it's not, you're fine, you're fine, you're fine, boom, you have type 2 diabetes. I want to know, what is my A1C doing? It's at 4.9, fantastic. A year later, it's moved up to 5.1. Okay, I'm gonna keep an eye on that. A year later, I'm at 5.3. Well, that's interesting, still okay, right? But we want to watch this trend. But unfortunately with conventional medicine, generally speaking, we don't get to know any of the stuff until, boom, disease is there. So we have to be really careful with that. And then the last test is the DiagnosTechs Adrenal Stress Panel. So DiagnosTechs was the first clinical testing laboratory to bring this revolutionary saliva test to the market. So this is a diurnal salivary test, including 4 cortisol readings and a DHEAS reading. So what this diurnal salivary reading means is you're actually going to, and this is a saliva test. So you get these little vials, and upon waking in the morning, somewhere around 6 to 8 in the morning, you're going to fill up this little vial. Seems really easy, but it's hard, takes forever to produce enough spit to fill up this little vial. You stick that in your refrigerator. You're going to do another one around the noon hour, stick that in your refrigerator. Another one around the 5-ish hour, stick that in your refrigerator. And then another one around 10 p.m. to midnight. Okay, and you stick that in the refrigerator. And then you have a 5th one that you're going to do because they're going to test your DHEA, which is also a very important hormone to test, and can give us a lot of answers to what's going on under that hormone. And so now we know it's not just going to the doctor and having them do a blood serum test on your cortisol levels, boom, one time during the day. I want to know what's going on with my cortisol levels throughout the day. You know, it should be highest in the morning, and then it should kind of drop down a little bit in the afternoon, a little bit lower around 5 o'clock, and then lowest around 10, right, to midnight. So we really want to see that full diurnal reading to see really what your body is doing with your cortisol levels. So anybody who's experiencing chronic stress, insomnia, a drop in your performance, anxiety, fatigue, having trouble losing weight, this test is a really great option. And here's the thing about cortisol levels. This is the hard part, is whether your cortisol levels are high or your cortisol levels are low, the symptoms are darn near like the exact same. So it's hard to say, well, I'm experiencing all these things, so let me just take the appropriate supplements to address what I'm experiencing. Well, it's hard because, see, if your cortisol levels are high, we have to make sure we're not taking any supplements that are going to stimulate your adrenals, right? Because that's going to make the problem worse. But if our cortisol levels are low, like mine, well, I definitely want to take some supplements that are going to stimulate my adrenals. Those are what's going to help me start to get my energy back, get my mojo back. So it's very valuable to know whether your cortisol levels are high or low. Now, if you don't have the money to do lab testing, you can take adaptogens, which are going to allow you to, if your cortisol levels are high, they're going to help bring them lower. If your cortisol levels are low, it's going to help bring them up a little bit. So they're going to help your cortisol levels adapt, which is why they're called adaptogens, things like ashwagandha, rhodiola, and all of those things can be very beneficial. But I'm a little bit more nerdy than that and like to know exactly what we're dealing with and exactly what we need to address. And so this test is a really great option for that. And I run this with a lot of clients. So optimal performance is what I'm about. So to just wrap it up, I strongly believe in order for us to have optimal performance, and again, this doesn't just have to be with our athletic endeavors. This is anything. This is our performance in life, because it feels really good to feel really good. And you actually don't know how good that feels until you have felt really bad. So I strongly believe in a properly formulated ketogenic diet. Okay. And there's many varieties of what type of ketogenic protocol to follow, right? We've heard of carnivore. That's fine if that works for your lifestyle. Ketovore, which is kind of like this combining carnivore with the ketogenic approach. So maybe I eat mostly meat. I'm still not eating vegetables, but I enjoy macadamia nuts and avocado. So there might be some different approaches in there, but I think that balancing of your blood sugar levels is going to be invaluable for living optimally and for the health of your future. I strongly believe that we need to increase our insulin sensitivity. The more insulin sensitive we are, the better. So we really want to see our blood serum insulin levels. We want them low, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so if we're getting upwards of 10 and over, we're really starting to see those levels increase, and we need to do something about that. And for some, this is not for all, but for some, incorporating training carbs can be beneficial for your performance. I'm not a fan of incorporating carbs here and there to try and increase fat loss. I don't personally, my philosophy doesn't believe in that. However, for performance, I can find great benefit with incorporating carbohydrates just around your workout. And then running labs where necessary. Sometimes I have clients, all they need is to switch over to a ketogenic approach. And with other clients, we've got more that we're dealing with. So just being open to the idea that maybe there are some labs that we need to run. So that's my presentation for you guys today. I hope you got something out of it. My website, really simple, TanyaPennington.com. And I'm sure you can find all of my information linked here as well. My Instagram, Tanya.Pennington. And you guys can reach out to me if you have any questions, happy to answer. If you're interested in any lab testing or working with me, happy to talk with you about that and set up a consult. We can set up a Zoom call. And thank you again. And I appreciate you guys being here.